Tonight, we step into suburban Chicago of the 1970s, a world of cul-de-sacs, backyard barbecues, and neighbors who wave from freshly mowed lawns. Beneath that postcard image, shadows fester. One man in particular wore his disguise perfectly. A contractor, a party clown, a civic volunteer. People saw a smile, not a snare, but behind the painted grin and neatly pressed suits, his house was swallowing boys whole. Crawl spaces became cemeteries, laughter became bait, and the American dream twisted into an American nightmare. This is a story of John Wayne Gacy, a tale not of monsters hiding in forests, but of evil sitting quietly next door. They said the smell was the first thing. The neighbors couldn't quite place it. Sweet and sour, metallic and chemical all at once. The kind of stench that lingers in your throat long after you've walked away. People joked about it. Maybe it was the plumbing, maybe the crawl space, maybe something rotting in the gutters. But what they didn't know, what no one wanted to know, was that beneath the manicured lawn of a clown for hire in suburban Chicago, the earth had been turned into a graveyard. Imagine the horror. A detective crawling through a narrow, suffocating trench beneath a house, his flashlight cutting through suffocating darkness. The beam finds something pale, something rounded, half buried in damp soil. At first, it could be mistaken for a mannequin's hand, but it wasn't plastic. It wasn't a doll. It was real, and it was reaching out from a pit of secrets. That hand did not belong to a stranger, to John Wayne Gacy. It belonged to someone who had once laughed, breathed, and trusted. Someone who vanished into thin air, only to resurface here, beneath a suburban house of painted smiles. And then there was a clown suit, that garish, grotesque costume hanging in a closet, complete with oversized shoes and smeared makeup. It wasn't a carnival prop. It was a mask, a disguise for a man who hid his cruelty beneath balloon animals and children's parties. The duality of it all is almost unbearable. Laughter on the outside, screams swallowed by concrete and dirt below. John Wayne Gacy was not the monster of fairy tales. He was worse. He blended in. He smiled at parades. He shook hands with politicians. He gave the illusion of normalcy. And that illusion bought him time. Time to carry out a reign of terror so quiet, so suffocating, that his neighbors had no idea they were living next to a human slaughterhouse. When police finally cracked open his world in 1978, they weren't prepared for the scope of what they would find. It wasn't one body or two or three. It was dozens. Each discovery punctuated by silence, broken only by the scrape of shovels in the frozen ground. Officers went pale. Some vomited. Others swore they'd never forget the smell. It wasn't just a crime scene. It was a revelation about the fragility of human trust, about how evil doesn't wear fangs or carry a scythe. It wears a red nose, cracks jokes, and waves from parade float. This is a twisted case of John Wayne Gacy. And to understand it, we have to go back to the world that let him exist, the childhood that shaped him, and the mask he stitched together, thread by thread, until no one could tell where the clown ended and the predator began. Chicago in the 1970s wasn't exactly the dystopia we like to imagine in hindsight, but it was a city on edge. Factories still roared. Neighborhoods were cloaked in Catholic guilt and Midwest politeness. And behind closed doors, fathers still reached for belts when words wouldn't do. The American dream was alive and rotting in the same breath. Gleaming station wagons in the driveway, television sets glowing in the living room, but also a simmering unease about crime, politics, and who you could really trust. It was an era of contradictions. On one hand, suburban sprawl promised safety. Neat rows of houses, community picnics, Rotary clubs, the illusion that nothing bad could penetrate a neighborhood where everyone waved and nobody asked questions. On the other hand, the headlines told a different story. Chicago was haunted by whispers of corruption, Gangs in the alleys, police departments stretched thin, and the sickening realization that predators were no longer confined to shadowy street corners. They could be your neighbor, your co-worker, even a man who shook your hand at church. Picture a block in Norwood Park Township, just outside city limits. Houses with trimmed hedges, mailboxes polished by bored dads, kids pedaling their bikes until the streetlights blinked on. And in the middle of it all, John Wayne Gacy. He hosted barbecues. He loaned out tools. He shook hands with local politicians and got his picture taken with the First Lady. If suburbia was supposed to be a fortress against the chaos of the world, Gacy was its most decorated gatekeeper. But here's the trick. The suburbs are staged, a perfect set where actors wear masks. Behind white fences, marriages crack like old paint. Behind locked basements, teenagers experimented with things they weren't supposed to. Behind the laughter of cocktail parties, people nursed their bitterness with gin and secrets. And in the Gacy household, behind those clownish grins and campaign buttons, there was something far darker festering. The 1970s was also the golden age of trust. Parents told their kids to be home by dinner, not worrying about where they went in between. Strangers offered rides. It wasn't always seen as a death sentence. Teenagers picked up odd jobs, painting houses, working construction, whatever neighbor down the street offered, and nobody thought twice. The predators of that era thrived not because they were geniuses, but because society hadn't yet learned to doubt the face of a friendly man. That was the ecosystem Gacy operated in. A world where appearances mattered more than suspicions, where communities prided themselves on not prying into each other's business. Chicago had its headlines filled with corruption and gangsters, but the suburbs lulled themselves into thinking they were immune. That complacency was as camouflage. The soil of Norwood Park wasn't cursed. It wasn't the town's architecture or the air in Chicago. The horror that unfolded there came from a man who weaponized trust, normalcy, and the American dream itself, turning picket fences into prison bars, and a clown's painted smile into the most terrifying mask of all. John Wayne Gacy didn't start life as the nightmare of Norwood Park. No, he started as a chubby kid in Chicago, the second son of a strict, alcohol-soaked father, and a mother who spent most of her energy trying to shield her children from his blows. That house wasn't filled with laughter. It was filled with insults, fists, and the endless message that John was not enough. Too weak, too soft, too unlike the man his father wanted him to be. It's tempting, almost seductive, to write off a monster's childhood as the sole blueprint of his crimes. But that would be too simple. Still, the pattern is hard to ignore. Gacy's father berated him for everything. His interests, his clumsiness, his inability to live up to the toxic idea of manhood. He was being force-fed. The boy was made to feel like an outsider in his own family, and outsiders tend to grow armor. His came in the form of charm. From an early age, Gacy learned how to smile through the shame. He learned how to shake hands, flatter, make himself indispensable. In school, he wasn't a star athlete, but he was the organizer, the kid who ran clubs, made connections, and inserted himself into every system of authority he could find. Even as a teenager, he was practicing the very skill that would later make him lethal, the art of manipulation. By the time he reached adulthood, Gacy had perfected the performance. He wasn't a stranger lurking in alleys. He was a somebody, a small-time businessman who ran construction gigs, a neighbor who hosted picnics, a man who volunteered in local Democratic campaigns. He even dressed up as Pogo the Clown for children's parties, as if the universe was writing horror fiction in real time and no one had the sense to see the foreshadowing. But Gacy's life wasn't just about balloons and business cards. Beneath the mask, he was battling demons he refused to name. His sexuality, his anger, his hunger for control, they fester in the shadow of his father's voice. Every insult, every blow from his childhood echoed. and in his twisted psyche, domination became his way of silencing those ghosts. And yet, people loved him. That's the most disorienting part. He was voted most likely to succeed in circles of men who admired his work ethic. Mothers let their sons work for him because he seemed trustworthy. Politicians shook his hand without knowing that those same hands had already crossed lines unspeakable. Gacy was a paradox of the American nightmare. The boy who grew up desperate for approval, who reinvented himself into a symbol of community pride, and who then weaponized that very trust to create his own private kingdom of horror. He wasn't born a monster. He became one, piece by piece, like a jigsaw puzzle only he could see, until the final picture was too grotesque for anyone else to comprehend. December 1978, the holiday season. Chicago glittered with Christmas lights, department stores blasted carols, and in Norwood Park, families settled into the warmth of routine. But in one quiet household, the air was split by panic. A teenage boy named Robert Pius didn't come home after work. He was supposed to meet his mother after his shift at a local pharmacy. Just a simple errand, a simple plan, the kind of thing a parent doesn't even think twice about. But he never showed. And when hours passed and the night bled into the early morning, his absence cracked open a nightmare. The last person to see him alive mentioned something strange. Robert had told a co-worker he was going to talk to a man about a potential construction job. Easy money, quick work, maybe the promise of better pay. That man's name? John Wayne Gacy. It's almost too cinematic to be real. A promising, athletic teenager, bright-eyed and ambitious, vanishing after a chance encounter with a neighborhood contractor/clown. But this wasn't fiction. This was the beginning of the unraveling. For Robert's family, those first hours were filled with desperate rationalizations. Maybe he ran off with friends. Maybe he got into trouble and was too scared to come home. Maybe, just maybe, he'd turn up by morning. But morning came and the silence remained. Parents know. They always know. And Robert's mother knew something had gone horribly wrong. This wasn't the first disappearance tied to Gacy, just the first one that refused to vanish quietly. For years, young men had slipped into his orbit and never returned. But back then, missing teenage boys were often dismissed as runaways. The 1970s police mindset was brutal in its apathy. If a young man vanished, he must have chosen to. Drugs, hitchhiking, rebellion, anything but abduction. And Gacy exploited that blind spot again and again. But Robert wasn't faceless. He had a family that refused to accept the lazy explanations. He was reliable, not the kind of vanish into thin air. His disappearance wasn't chalked up to teenage rebellion. It was treated as a rupture in the fabric of suburban safety. And that difference would prove fatal to Gacy's carefully crafted illusion. Neighbors still waved when Gacy left his driveway. He still wore the mask of community man, the go-to guy for construction gigs, the clown who painted smiles. But under the floorboards, his house was a tomb. And with Robert's disappearance, the first cracks began to form in the facade. A family's grief became the wedge that pried open the coffin door. The tragedy of the first disturbance is that it wasn't the first at all. It was simply the one that finally forced the world to look. Here's where the story stops being a suburban ghost tale and starts mutating into something grotesque, like a carnival mirror that bends reality until you can't tell what's real anymore. After Robert Pius vanished, police did the obvious thing. They looked into John Wayne Gacy. On paper, he was the last person known to have spoken with the boy. Easy, right? A quick interview, maybe a search, case closed. Except nothing about Gacy ever worked on the surface level. When detectives knocked on his door, they were greeted not by a lurking creep, but by a man who smiled too wide, offered them coffee, and cracked jokes about how absurd it was that he be involved in something like this. The cops were used to nervous suspects, defensive suspects, even hostile suspects. But Gacy? He was rehearsed, polished, almost too cooperative. It was theater, and they were unwitting audience members. But the mask slipped in strange little ways. When questioned, Gacy spun stories that contradicted themselves, alibis that didn't quite align, timelines that stuttered. Detectives noticed the smell too, that infamous smell. It clung to the house like rot clings to a cellar. Gacy blamed it on plumbing issues. And in a society where homeowners patched drywall and shrugged off mildew, the excuse worked, at least temporarily. Meanwhile, whispers began to resurface. People remembered other young men who had worked for Gacy's construction business, boys who had gone missing, names that had been half forgotten because they had been stamped with a runaway label. Suddenly, Robert Pius' case wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern, a dark constellation of disappearances orbiting one man. And then came the sightings. Neighbors reported odd things. Teenagers entering Gacy's house and never being seen again. Strange sounds at night. The way he worked in the crawl space at odd hours. Digging, shoveling, muttering to himself. But hindsight is cruel. In the moment, these were dismissed as quirks. Who digs at 3 a.m.? A man obsessed with fixing drainage, apparently. Every layer of the mystery only made the truth harder to swallow. Could this friendly clown, this community volunteer, really be hiding something so sinister? The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. People wanted to believe he was guilty, because the alternative meant admitting that you could never really know anyone. That evil doesn't wear horns. It wears a suit and tie, paints its face, and waves from parade floats. By the time investigators finally began to piece it together, the mystery wasn't where is Robert Pius anymore. It was how many Roberts came before him, and that's when the paranoia began to spread. Parents locked their doors earlier. Teenagers whispered rumors in school hallways. The neighborhood that had once trusted a clown now began to wonder. Had they all been living inside a circus tent the whole time, blind to the horror buried beneath their feet? Detectives were no longer looking for a missing boy. They were circling a shark who had been feeding in plain sight for years. The problem was, Gacy was slippery. He'd been down this road before, arrested years earlier for an assault in Iowa, but he'd wriggled out with parole and a reinvention of himself as a model citizen. That stain on his record should have been a red flag. Instead, it was filed away, gathering dust while he built a new empire trust in Chicago. The investigation into Robert Pius' disappearance became a masterclass in psychological warfare. Police tailed Gacy around the clock, expecting him to slip up. What they didn't anticipate was just how brazen he'd become. Gacy taunted them, inviting them into his home while the crawl space literally whispered with the weight of the dead beneath their feet. He cracked jokes, offered beer, even handed over materials from his construction business. Imagine the arrogance. A man under suspicion for murder, playing host to the very people digging his grave. And yet, theories swirled because nothing was solid. Yet, was Pius simply another runaway? Had he gotten into a fight, vanished into the city, maybe fallen victim to someone else entirely? Some detectives whispered that maybe the boy's family was overreacting. Others muttered about the stench in Gacy's house, the strange way he explained himself, and wondered if the entire neighborhood was standing on the edge of a mass grave. Every scrap of evidence raised more questions. They found jewelry in his house that didn't belong to him, receipts for film development that tied him directly to boys who had vanished. But the receipts could be explained away. The jewelry could have been left behind by workers. Nothing screamed guilt until you looked at the pattern. The sheer accumulation of coincidences stacked like bones in the dirt. What made it worse was how long Gacy had been overlooked. Neighbors remembered seeing young men enter his house, then never again. Police departments had fielded missing persons reports that pointed his way. But the era's blind spot, the deadly assumption that teenage boys ran away on their own, was Gacy's shield. For years, His crimes were hiding in plain sight because nobody wanted to believe that dozens of suns could vanish without setting off alarms. Theories sprouted like weeds. Was he part of a larger ring? Some hidden network preying on Chicago's youth? Was there an accomplice who lured boys in? Or was this simply one man's empire of control, a theater of cruelty orchestrated by a single hand? Detectives could feel the walls closing in, but they needed proof. Hard, irrefutable proof. And proof, as it turned out, was buried beneath Gacy's feet. Waiting, silent, unblinking, for someone brave enough to dig. December 21st, 1978. Snow crusted over Chicago like a shroud. Detectives had been tailing Gacy for days, and he was unraveling in real time. Imagine the swagger of a man who once thought himself untouchable, now pacing, drinking too much, talking too loudly, muttering to himself in bars like a Shakespearean villain mid-breakdown. The pressure was crushing him, and for the first time in years, his mask began to crack. He started confessing in fragments, not to the police, but to friends, to his lawyers, to anyone unlucky enough to be caught in his spiral. You know, I've done things. Terrible things. He'd say it, then laugh it off like a bad joke. But there was no joke in his eyes. His arrogance had rotted into something else. Desperation. The turning point came when investigators finally secured a search warrant. This time, not just for surface-level checks, but for the crawl space. That dark, suffocating underbelly of his house that had loomed in whispers and suspicions. Officers descended into that trench with flashlights and shovels, not quite ready for what they would unearth. The first discovery was small fragments of bones, so fragile they could have been mistaken for animal remains. But then came the unmistakable shape of a human skull. One skull, then another, and another. The crawl space wasn't just storage. It was a catacomb. Imagine being one of those officers. You signed up to protect the community, maybe chase down burglars, maybe break up bar fights. You never thought you'd be kneeling in the frozen earth beneath a neighbor's house, counting bodies like tally marks in the dirt. Some officers gagged. Others went silent, their faces drained of all color. Because the truth was undeniable. They weren't looking for one missing boy anymore. They were standing on top of dozens. That night, Gacy's empire collapsed. He was arrested, no longer the host of suburban barbecues or the smiling clown. He was shackled, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. His world finally stripped the lies he had built. And the neighborhood, the same streets where children once pedaled their bikes past his door, was thrown into a fevered dream of disbelief. The breakdown wasn't just Gacy's. It was society's. The illusion of suburban safety had been shattered, the American dream flipped inside out to reveal a nightmare living beneath linoleum floors. Neighbors stare at their own lawns, at their own basements, wondering what secrets might lie beneath. The turning point wasn't the discovery of one body. It was the discovery of many, too many, and the horrifying realization that nobody had noticed until it was far too late. The crawl space became the evidence room of hell itself. As officers dug, day after day, the numbers rose. 20, 25, 30. By the time the final tally was reached, 33 lives had been extinguished, most of them stacked in that suffocating trench beneath Gacy's home. It wasn't just crime, it was architecture. He had built a necropolis under his feet, arranging boys like macabre furniture, sometimes layering bodies atop one another as though the ground itself had to bend to his compulsion. The official resolution came fast. The state of Illinois had no patience for ambiguity. Gacy was charged, tried, and convicted in a case that shocked even the most jaded of jurors. The evidence was overwhelming. The bodies, the belongings of the victims, his own muttered confessions. The trial wasn't about guilt. It was about whether anyone could even comprehend the scale of his crimes. He was sentenced to death. 12 counts of it. In fact, stacked like a ledger of vengeance. And for years, he sat on death row, painting portrait of clowns that nobody asked for, giving interviews where he denied, then admitted, then denied again. Even in confinement, he weaponized confusion, manipulating narratives until truth and lies blurred into a carnival of contradictions. And yet, the questions never stopped multiplying. Why 33? Why those boys? Did he choose at random, or were there patterns only he could see? Some investigators swore he couldn't have acted alone, that the logistics of luring, overpowering, and disposing of so many victims suggested accomplices. But none were ever found. Others wondered how many more might have been lost, their remains scattered in rivers or fields, never traced back to him. Then there was the question that haunted every parent in Chicago. How did no one see? How did the community attend his parties, laugh at his jokes, vote for his causes, while their sons were being buried beneath his living room? Was it willful ignorance, the blindness of trust, or the perfect camouflage of a man who wore his mask so convincingly that no one thought to peel it away? The resolution was official. John Wayne Gacy, guilty of 33 murders, sentenced to die. But the lingering questions refused to settle, because behind the gavel slam, behind the guilty verdict, lingered the sense that something bigger had slipped through the cracks. It wasn't just about one man's monstrosity. It was about the system, the society, the neighbors who looked away until the stench forced them to look down. When the dust settled, Chicago was left with more than a number, 33. It was left with a scar. Parents clutched their children tighter. Teenagers who once saw the suburbs as playgrounds now saw them as cages. The myth of the safe neighborhood was punctured, bleeding out into every living room that had once watched Gacy wave in parades. The face paint was gone, but the imprint of the clown never left. The aftermath was grotesquely commercial in some corners. Gacy became a macabre celebrity on death row, churning out clown paintings that collectors bought like cursed relics. Some framed them, others burned them, but all who handled them admitted the same thing. They felt dirty, as if owning one meant letting his shadow seep into your house. His artwork was less canvas than contagion, but beyond the circus of notoriety, there were real consequences. The case forced police departments across the country to reconsider how they handled missing persons, especially teenage boys. No longer could they simply dismiss them as runaways. Each vanished child now carried the ghost of Norwood Park. Each report a reminder that negligence had once allowed a predator to thrive. The legacy also seeped into culture. Gacy was not just a man anymore. He became a myth, a boogeyman stitched into the American psyche. He was whispered about at sleepovers, invoked in horror movies, and dissected in endless documentaries. Even Stephen King's, with its killer clown Pennywise, owes some of its dread to the shadow cast by John Wayne Gacy. Pogo the clown had become folklore, the smiling face of evil disguised as innocence. And yet, the true legacy might be quieter, crueler. It's in the way neighbors look at each other now, the suspicion that hides beneath politeness, the gnawing thought that you never really know the man who lives 3 houses down, mowing his lawn, waving with a practiced grin. Gacy taught America that evil isn't always a stranger in the alley. It can be the man who hands out candy at parades, the neighbor who invites your son to work a job, the clown who ties balloon animals with a smile. The aftermath was justice, yes, but it was also a loss of innocence. The suburbs could never again pretend to be sealed off from darkness. Because once you've seen a carnival mask ride into a predator's grin, you never look at painted smiles or your neighbors the same way again. There's a detail I can't shake. Not the clown suit, not the crawl space, not even the number 33. But the image of Gacy at his execution. May 1994, he looked the same as ever, smug, rehearsed, defiant. His final words were a sneer, a dismissal, something meant to sting rather than redeem. And in that moment, it was clear, He never regretted, never repented, never even truly admitted to the scope of what he'd done. He walked into death with the same mask he'd worn in life. That's the part that lingers. We crave neat conclusions. A monster is caught, a trial is held, a punishment is carried out, order restored. But John Wayne Gacy wasn't a monster in the fairy tale sense. He was human, terrifyingly human. He ate dinner, he watched TV, he paid his bills, he made balloon animals, and then he buried people beneath his house. The horror wasn't just what he did. It was how normal he seemed while doing it. What do you do with that knowledge? That the smiling neighbor might not just be hiding debt or an affair, but something unspeakable? That trust itself can be weaponized, twisted, hollowed out until it becomes a trap? Gacy didn't just kill boys. He killed the illusion that evil announces itself. He taught us that it doesn't. And maybe that's the true legacy of his case. Not the body count, not the circus of his paintings or the fascination with his name, but the uneasy truth that we are terrible at spotting darkness when it's dressed in daylight. Evil doesn't arrive with thunderclaps and ominous music. It arrives with a handshake, a joke, a smile beneath a painted mask. That's why Gacy unsettles us even now. Because when we tell ourselves, I would have known, I would have seen, his ghost laughs. No, you wouldn't have. No one did. That's the final trick of the clown. He doesn't just vanish into the darkness. He leaves you staring at every smiling face around you, wondering what might be hiding underneath. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.